Hello everyone, welcome back. So this time we're finally getting into the analysis of a wedge, figuring out how friction and those normal forces keep a wedge in place and allow us to use a wedge to lift things up. So let's figure it out. Oh, here we go. So a wedge is a very simple machine. We use a small force P to lift a large weight W. We don't lift it very much, but we're able to lift it. Now, if we're going to determine the force required to push the wedge in or to pull it out, we're going to have to draw some free body diagrams. And this is where you have to be very, very careful with how you draw these. Normal forces typically make sense. The wedge is being squished from both sides, so normal forces just point towards the surface. The force P, that's usually given. However, frictional force, you have to think, what direction is this wedge moving? And the force P is not a good identifier of that. Okay? Because maybe the force P that I'm applying is just enough to keep the wedge from moving backwards. It might be that this weight is too much, it's squishing the wedge out, and your force is just like, oh, don't go out. I'm holding you in place. Or that force P could be enough that it's about to push it in. There's any more force. So in one way, friction is more or less helping you, saying, I'm going to help try to hold it back. That way, friction is resisting you. So you have to think about this. Okay, which direction is this about to move? Sometimes it's given, sometimes it's not. And friction resists movement. And it's always parallel to the surface. Okay? Friction resists movement. Don't forget that. Okay. You think you're done there? No. It's going to be multiple free body diagrams. You have one for each object in your system, and also one for the total system as a whole. So here's my big object I'm lifting. And once again, you're going to have friction applied to the surfaces, one at the wall, one on the side right here, and normal forces. Normal forces are always perpendicular. That makes it really easy. Frictional forces are always parallel, but what direction are they going? And finally, these objects usually have a weight. Now, let's look at this frictional force 2 right here. Notice it's in the opposite direction of the frictional force right here. If you're wondering why that is, it's because this, force 2, is the force of the friction on this object, preventing motion of this object. While this frictional force is how much friction that the bottom object is applying to the top. So they're always in equal and opposite directions. Equal and opposite directions. So if you draw an arrow in one direction for one, you have to draw it in the opposite for the other. And if this still doesn't make sense to you, you're just like trying to figure out, I can't figure out that direction, you're going to have to practice. Be super honest with it. This is not one of those ones where you can just take it like, oh, well, it'll work out fine. It won't work out fine. You've got to make sure you're careful. So my advice to you is stick with the wedge. Start with the wedge, figure out what direction that is moving, and then you can figure out, okay, once I move those arrows, I just reverse it for the things it's contacting. That can help you. That will probably work better. Okay. So then to determine our unknowns, how do we do this? It's equations of equilibrium. Like always, equations of equilibrium. Some of the forces in the x direction. Got our friction, our normal force, that one has an x component, and our normal force 3. Forces in the y direction, F3, this one again, even our frictional force, and the weight. So it's not going to be necessarily very easy equations. And you quickly see, well, why I have to have 2 free body diagrams. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4 unknowns here. I have 3 equations. That's not enough. So I have to take some some equations from my previous free body diagram to solve this. Once again, it might be very, very helpful to master your matrix function in your calculator. As a note, I'm still looking for like a digital calculator so I can show that to you on the screen. Haven't found one yet. Eventually, I might just have to take a video of me doing it with my phone or something. That looks very nice. Last thing we can remember is that we have our frictional equation here, okay? That can be another answer. But only if we know that its motion is impending. If it's not, then we know that the force, we can't really tell what the force is. Because it's going to be just enough to equal the load pushing on it. Okay. Now this is a good question. Which one should we analyze first? Well, honestly, the one with the least unknowns. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Technically, we have 3 equations of equilibrium and 1 frictional equation, so 1, 2, 3, 4 unknowns. If we knew the weight, we could solve that. Same here. If we knew the load, we could solve this one. So with that, you might have the ability to solve. Also, frictional equations. These are not necessarily the same equation. The normal forces are different, and therefore the frictional forces are going to be different. Okay, now here's the other option. Before, we were pushing it in. Now we're pulling it out. And guess what? Because we've done this, the frictional forces are going to be reversed. Second thing to note is that if that force P that you are required to pull it out is positive, then the wedge is self-locking. It means if you let it go, it would stay there on its own. If it's negative, then it means that you didn't actually need to apply any force to pull it out. It's just going to happen. We're all about impending motion, so that's why you might solve for a negative number. How much force do you have to apply to keep it from popping out? Okay, one last little detail. Let's get on belt analysis. I'm going to pull these on here. Now, belt analysis, right here. You see that this belt is contacting the surface for a certain arc. That is how we're going to figure out the friction here. It's contacting it for beta radians, and I really want you to remember radians. Radians, radians, radians. If you ever have an equation that's not like sine of theta, cosine of theta, you're going to need to make sure that you always keep things in radians. In fact, just always stick to radians. I know it's not really as nice to look at. Like for most people, you don't think in radians. But for equations, it's always going to be asking for radians. So, get radians. So, you have a tension on this side. You have a tension on the other side. And if we pull with too much force at T2, the belt's going to slip. So if the belt slips, or is just about to slip, then this tension must be larger than the original tension, as well as the motion resisting frictional forces. So T2 is always going to be greater than T1. It's always going to be greater than T1. There's no real way it couldn't be that case, unless we have like a motor right here, perhaps. That might happen. Now there is a very detailed analysis of how we get to this next equation. Just take it at face value for now. It is not a fun one to do. But what you can do is you can see that T2 is going to be equal to T1 times the exponential of the coefficient of friction times the number of radians that they're in contact. And as I said before, radians, radians, radians. Always radians. Okay. I think that's everything for now. Yep, we're just going to an example. So we'll stop here for now, and then I'll see you all next time as we solve an example using these wedges, using belts, and having some fun with it. Friction can be hard, but it is something good to learn. You need to learn it for real life. I mean, you can't walk without friction. So I hope this helps you, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.